We meet in an hour of change and challenge, in a decade of hope and fear, in an age of both knowledge and ignorance. If this capsule history of our progress teaches us anything, it is that man in his quest for knowledge and progress is determined and cannot be deterred. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win.
So we are here today on the Energy Impact Podcast with Angel Eduardo Cardenas Sosa, who is the Director of Infrastructure Projects at the CAF, the Development Bank of Latin America. Angel, thank you and welcome to the show.
No, well, thank you. And again, it's an honor to be here with you. It's really good.
Well, you'd love to learn about development finance in Latin America from the expert himself. But before we do, we'd actually love to learn a little bit about you, who you are, what your background is, what made you the man you are today.
Oh, well, that's, I don't know if it's a fun question or a fun answer, but anyway, so in a nutshell, I'm passionate about development since I remember. I think I always wanted to go to school in economics and work at economic development, which I did. I was fortunate enough, and then I was fortunate enough to start working at multilateral development banks, first in Washington, D.C., at the World Bank Group, and then I transitioned into a regional development bank, which is called CAF, Latin American Development Bank. And I've been here for almost 15 years already. And I started off as an economist, and then I got lured into more of the business side and with infrastructure. So I've been energy, transportation, telecom, and all type of infrastructure, and basically financing governments and private sector. And
where did this initial interest in economics come from, though? When you were younger and you were picking what to study, how did you settle on numbers and math and finance and economics?
Well, a few things. I mean, I think when you are born in a country, although Venezuela at the time, it was a middle-income country, but you could see the inequality, that you could be in a good neighborhood and didn't see far up in the hills. You would see precarious habitats or houses, and you would see the inequality. I think that definitely shocked me. And then I think when I was very little, there was a political turmoil in my country, and it was basically as a consequence at the moment of protest against, ironically, some multilateral development bank programs. This is back in the 90s. And it was just my passion, it just became my passion. I wanted to do good. I wanted to give back. I wanted to make something out of the great opportunities I had that I've been fortunate to have in my family. And it all worked out. I mean, I think, my first experience in US, which opened the door for learning English, was when I was in high school as an exchange student. So I lived in Minneapolis. So that opened up a lot of doors because I could get a sort of a sense of how to speak the language, which was 30 or less than 30 years ago. It was a big deal to learn a different language and to be fluent. And then I got a scholarship in the States. I studied there and started working at the bank, got the opportunity to move back home with the bank, transition into this other. And ever since I remember, or I can recall, I have been passionate about development economics. I've been tempted a couple times with the private sector. I did some sort of secondment in an impact investment fund, but I even got job interviews with investment banks in Europe. But to be honest, to me, it's development. So I 100% committed to this.
So tell us, what is a development bank? And you've mentioned the idea of a multilateral development bank. Most people probably only know of banks like, hey, I put my money in a bank and, they hold on to my money and I get it out later. What makes a development bank unique and special, and what role does it play in the broader economy?
Well, to be surprised how many times I get a phone call and like, so can I deposit anyway $500? And you have to be kind and polite, but also tell them, well, we kind of work in huge tickets deals, and it's kind of funny. Friends that come up to you at the beginning, it was like, so is there any good loans for cars? I'm like, no, it doesn't work like that. So basically, development banks have important roles. Try to work where there are market failures. And in the case of energy, it's a good example. How sometimes the financing structures are not commercially viable at the moment, but there are banks that with a clear development mandate that is to support the country's national development agenda, want to promote or incentivize this investing. So at some points there's a scalable. So for instance, renewable energy, let's jump into that. In Argentina, a few years back with Renovar, which was the renewable energy program, the government needed to de-risk the structures in terms of to make it commercially viable and more importantly, appealing to investors. But you needed to have banks that would be able to provide longer duration or tenures and somewhat affordable interest rates to make these first transactions viable and to make a leading case, and then to scale that. So development banks come in there with a very bank-oriented perspective, but understanding that, if we can solve or help to solve the market failure, we'll be doing our job. And we team up with private banks that actually are more likely to work with us because they understand not only that we have a strong balance sheet, but that we also have, we are owned by the governments, that's what is interesting about the governments. Development banks are owned by the governments. In our case, there are 19 countries in Latin America that are our owners, although there is quite an independent administration that will run things. And but private investors see that as an advantage because that could de-risk any potential political issue that could arise, or exchange rate freezing, or issues, or all sort of things that that if you partner up with a development bank could do. But so that's one part that development banks do. But also we work a lot in sectoral strategies in terms of generate and promote applied knowledge in terms of policymaking, hopefully gathering the lessons learned and the best experience that could be applied into the public management of our countries, but also to work with the private sector players. For instance, entrepreneurs, innovation, innovators, technology, how in an emerging markets or Latin American market, that it's the one that I'm working with, you could learn from the experiences in different countries, and more importantly, how can you help them to beat the market failure and hopefully make it scalable. And so we do that, and we also work directly with the investment programs of the countries, and that's something that I've been working with in the last couple of years, how the different ministries or secretaries of infrastructures and public works require X amount of money to develop impactful projects, and we provide the financing in terms that are appealing and are more manageable for governments. And we range from projects from large highways to sustainable transportation, like huge metros in Sao Paulo or Quito or Panama. So that's what we do. So we're a mix in between the private sector because we are a bank, and but also as an international organization, and we definitely have connections with that governmental side, because at the end we're owned by governments. And
so just to make sure I understand, there are a company, just like I might want to get a loan to start a small business. There are companies out there that want to do big project development that need tens of millions or hundreds of millions of dollars as a loan in order to help facilitate the growth of their business. But there is a misalignment sometimes between what the market will support. Maybe a project is a little bit more risky or a little bit more costly, but the project has some other natural benefit to it. Maybe it creates jobs, or maybe it brings clean energy to a country. So the governments want to kind of like tip the scale a little bit to better align their overall mission with the direct economic implications of that, one specific deal. Is that about right?
It's about right, and you touch upon a point that is very important. We also are involved in transactions that generate impact, economic impact, and that you mentioned. I mean, it's hopefully that would be environmentally sustainable, and that create welfare to society overall in general. So our projects, and that's part of how we assess or evaluate our projects, have to meet certain criteria, and
And what
because
is
I
it?
mean,
Yeah. And
yeah,
what does the
go ahead.
term multilateral mean as opposed to just a development bank?
Do you know what? I think it's more of a historic concept. I think it all started out with Bretton Woods after the Second War, and with the IMF and the World Bank. And I think it was the concept of living in a multilateral glove or world where, like, I mean, there was necessarily different players that were relevant or stakeholders in this international financial architecture discussion. And I think that evolved into a development bank, and then more, if you take, for instance, the International Monetary Fund, the IMF is a multilateral bank because, I mean, it has different players or from different countries, but it specializes on macroeconomic financing, whereas the World Bank, which is its sister or organization, specializes in financing development projects that will generate development, economic development. So I think that's different. But I think, I mean, you could interchange that. And to be honest, I don't know. I would probably go for development bank more than multilateral. But actually, that's a business line that has been growing a lot in the investment banking, DFIs, development finance institutions, or development finance business units. Because, I mean, with all the ESG, I mean, investment firms understand that they have to chip in also in this market segment.
And how do the different countries all get along? And how do they express their different priorities? Because I imagine if there's some amount of subsidy involved, in order to make the deal happen, are different players coming in at different rates? And how does that affect the prioritization of where the projects actually go? What's the story there?
Well, that's a very interesting question. So we all development banks in general, as they are pretty independent in terms of like their funding business model. I mean, they tend to have very competitive rates or interest rate. I mean, they do their fundraising at very competitive rates that could probably be more better than even the country members. So that happens. And so what happens is basically it has the business model of a bank. It has a capitalization structure, and that capitalization structure allows you to have an X amount of annual envelope of, let's say, Mexico's got up to $800 million in financing. And what you do in terms of, sometimes you split it between what is going to be placed on the public sector financing window, and then some other in the private sector financing window, and you negotiate in the context of what makes more sense in terms of economic development, what it's aligned with the national development strategy, and more importantly, what is also aligned with what we consider is not the right development strategy, what we consider is a suitable development strategy in the region. So let's say we tend to focus on the infrastructure sector, a lot of energy, transportation, sustainable transportation, and roads. just to say it, and a lot of like internet connection and telecom, because we
And
understand.
what I'm hearing with all of these things is, and tell me if I'm wrong, but these things are enablers of prosperity, and these things are like the foundation that is required for the rest of the economy to grow. It's like you establish telecommunication, you establish transportation, you establish energy infrastructure. All of a sudden now it's easier for the local people within these countries to create their own businesses and for bigger businesses to form. Is that part of the theme of how you
Yes,
guys select projects?
because you would frame it in terms of what I mean, what develops or what creates economic impact or economic development impact, and at the end, it's all about productivity increase and competitiveness. And when we use the example of infrastructures, at the end are drivers that would actually propel or spur economic growth and would enable many stakeholders to do better and to get more chances. Yes, you are correct.
So what are some of the big projects that your bank has, really, helped pioneer or been responsible for, allowing to move forward? Are there classic examples that you guys like to reference?
I think, I mean, as we started off, we've been 50 years already. I mean, we turned 50 this year. And I think we worked a lot and we financed a lot of integration projects under the premise that, I mean, if you want to promote economic growth in a region, this region needs to be integrated and hopefully do some intra-region trade. So, but when you see the countries, I mean, they did not have the connectivity capabilities in terms of like, connecting, transporting goods or people. So we
So like
work a
literal
lot.
roads and highways and maybe even railroads between countries?
Exactly, exactly. And with that in mind, I mean, the state Bolivia, for example, that it's one of the countries I see in my portfolio, would finance more than 5,000 kilometers in terms of roads,
Wow.
and roads that would connect isolated populations or to different markets, and more importantly, to generate and spur the economic growth. Because I mean, the thesis behind this, if you connect, markets, if you connect people, there would be exchange, and also that would lead to more economic growth. But then we also have a lot of projects in terms of transmission, energy transmission, again, to hopefully support governments and countries in terms of providing a secure service and hopefully bring more productivity to people.
Right, because that's a classic example of like a rising tide floats all boats. I mean, you might have one country that has like abundant hydro resources. They might actually have more energy in that local region than they can even handle. And then they've got a neighboring country that's physically very close to them and could use some of that cheap energy to help grow their economy. But if you can't make that connection across the two countries, then you can't take advantage of that resource. Is that one of the examples?
That's a good example. And you would have countries that would actually waste their energy, and that otherwise they would have connected and transmitted to neighboring countries where the energy was needed. And but the proper infrastructure wasn't in place.
Mm.
So you would have to develop. So those are type of infrastructure. More recently, and we've worked a lot in more of the social side of the infrastructure, combining that what it's required, like the hardware infrastructure, which is the proper infrastructure to enable, but along with content and more software and hardware in terms of like connectivity to schools, for instance, and connect last mile connectivity to people, and hopefully to help populations transition into the fourth industrial revolution standards in terms of achieving more STEM's capabilities, and providing that bridge so they could update and hopefully engage successfully in the fourth industrial revolution.
And what types of projects do you guys have going on right now, and what are the various stages? Like, do you guys have like clear, like earmarked, like we're evaluating stage, we are actively financing stage, we're recouping our money state? What are the various stages?
I've seen it all happen at the same time, and it's more based on a project cycle. So we take a project cycle, a transaction cycle, and it's pretty standard in terms of like banking. I mean, you would apply to development banking, but you would probably apply it in any other transaction. So they could be happening either originating or recuperating at the same time. So, but in my case, I would say I'm working a lot on sustainable transportation these days, and we've been working a lot in renewable energies, and we've been working a lot in connectivity and telecommunications. I mean, recently we've financed satellite programs for one country in the region that has a capability to design, build, and launch satellites and improve and solve their digital divide and gap. And then also we've worked a lot in the education sector in terms of connectivity to educational centers and population and telemedicine. So,
And how does a deal happen? Does the private developer have to find you? Do you guys find the developers? Is there a matchmaking service somewhere? How does a deal come together?
you have a couple windows. So, and I mean, I would start off like with the public sector window. So basically, the demand in countries is always superior to what our offer could be. So we have a limited offer of resources, and so governments could establish their priorities, and we go to what we call the programming mission, which is basically how we sit together. But we've been working a lot with our country office first in developing a strategy and hopefully prioritizing out of what they are thinking it's good for them in terms of investment, what would actually match our strategy and where we could add value. Because we also need to understand, I mean, our financing is worth if we could maximize our value addition. If not, that's making sense. I mean, they could have different sources. So once you have this prioritized pipeline, you have more of a formal process when you talk to the government authorities, and this sometimes is on an annual basis, and you agree on a formal pipeline, and of course you just, I mean, basically direct or channel all the resources to develop any technical assistance that is needed to actually come to a mature project and then evaluate it, approve it, sign it, formalize it, and then disperse. So that happens in the public sector. When we're talking to private sector, that we also do, it's more like a bank. Basically, I mean, there's the private developers and renewable energy. Let's take one. I mean, there are in private developers that want to build a 100 megawatts solar plant in Chile, and they basically, I mean, start the whole reaching out to us, and we begin what we call the originating process, the loan origination process, and we see first with a teaser, and we understand what the economics of the projects are from the technical side, from the environmental side, and if that checks, and we also see in terms of like the character as well, we proceed to hopefully write an engagement letter, and we start our due diligence. And if this requires any syndication, we reach out to our global partners in terms of funding or syndication, and we develop a structure, and we then finish our due diligence. We go to a credit committee, approve it, and then we negotiate the contract, and we start disbursing, and we continue following the project. So it's pretty much a standard. And we also do less comparatively to our loan portfolio, but we also do equity. So I mean, we partnered up with funds, and we've been doing a lot of fintech and innovation and energy, and we also do again, a proposal comes or interest in terms of a potential private equity investment, and we do all the due diligence, and if it checks, we go ahead. So basically.
And is that unusual for banks? In the US, I feel like if a bank does loans, maybe you can't do equity. I might be wrong on that, but is that like a unique capability of your bank to be able to do both loans and equity?
So we definitely have independence. but we have our different business units. So you would find that again, development banks could do that because they would have the private and public sector window.
Got
The
it.
thing is that if you're in the sector and you're interested about infrastructure across the board, you could probably add value in all this process, perhaps in the origination process and the structuring, but of course you would have units that are specialized in products in terms of like, I mean, you need somebody come in to do the product appraisal, says, you know what, this checks, continuing in the evaluation and the approval and disbursement stages.
And how do you guys do product appraisals? Are we talking about evaluating like the technology itself, or is it an evaluation of many characteristics of the project, including like, the management team and other aspects like that?
It's a very broad view. So it's very broad view, and we take into account many dimensions. I mean, we have a responsibility with our shareholders, so we maximize that where we put our money, our financing. It's the more capable people. So management is definitely for sure, and the financial part, the economics is definitely key. But we also have sectoral or specialists, technical specialists that are part of our teams that could give us an independent overview or assessment, either technology, either the construction, whatever the final financing destination is. They could provide an independent assessment that sometimes, when it's private sector, I mean, we compare it to the independent review that normally these firms have or these investments have. So, because yes.
And then how do you guys handle the technology side? Because I imagine, evaluating the technology of a 100-megawatt solar plant, well, it's a big solar plant, is still very different than evaluating the technology of a company that shoots satellites in this space. So how do you think about such a broad technology, palette that you guys have to extend across?
Luckily, we have different teams with different expertise.
And this is internal? You have internal people of all the different expertise?
We have a lot of internal capacity.
Awesome.
and it's required. And we also could get consultants. I mean, that have to go through a very competitive process and very strict checks in terms of like a proficiency, technical proficiency that could be part of our teams during that. We did, and this is something that would absolutely interest you, like 12 years ago, we did the refurbishing of a nuclear plant in Argentina.
Oh, cool. Very cool.
Yeah. So I happened to go, I went like 10 or 15 times. No, I went like 10 times to this plant. And every time I went, it was literally a PhD class, of course, because I had these amazing consultants that were working for me. But at the end, these guys are like the brightest of the brightest. And so we had discussions in terms of technology. And so they could digest a lot of the technical part that were needed for us to not to approve the transaction, but to monitor the ongoing process or the disbursement process and the construction part or refurbishing part of this plant. So that's an example. And the same happens with satellite. I mean, it's, I think one of the takeaways of my career here is I have seen a lot of different sectors, and it has been very interesting. So I don't remember a boring day in a project. There's always something new, and
that's awesome. I wish that a lot of young people could hear what you're saying right now, because I bet that a lot of people, I know I did when I was younger, think, oh, bankers, that's probably a boring job. But what you're telling me is you get to travel around the world looking at the newest and really meaningful technology, and then meet with some of the smartest people in that sector and have to learn a whole new space, over and over and over again, which sounds a lot more exciting than like, quote unquote, being a banker.
I always joked around with my friends that there are two types of bankers, and this is a bad joke, but gonna say it anyway, the bad ones and the good ones, the development bankers. So yeah, because I mean there is a prejudice that bankers are boring or bad. No, I think we again I'm in a sector that we could do good. We could be sophisticated in terms of like using state of the art products in financing, but we also have a very close exposure to policy making, to public policy making, which was my other interest, and that's where the connection is between the financial side and the economic development. I mean, because we are exposed to public policy.
So tell me more about that, because it seems to me that with so many countries under the umbrella of your bank, that it's not just one policy, it's like a lot of policies that you have to understand and be informed of and keep aware of. So what are some of the challenges associated with that?
Well, I think you have a continuum or a range very broad of different policies. I mean, you would have some policies that would be more open in terms of economic performance, and some that would be more closed. And but I think what you develop throughout time, it's understanding. It's going beyond the prejudice and understanding, or the bias and understanding that whatever they're proposing, if it makes sense in terms of economic development, you should back it up and support it and develop alternative that would make it your financing functional and useful to them. So, but yes, I mean, you develop throughout time quite an expertise to understand regulatory frameworks and policy making processes, and understanding a clear stakeholder map in many countries that you're shocked sometimes. It's like, how do I know this if I haven't been there, I don't know, in 6 months, or you read the paper and you connect the dots. So yeah, and that makes it interesting. So again, with the whole banking thing, that makes it interesting.
Can you tell me maybe a story of a specific project, as long as nothing's, confidential, but tell me a story of a particular project that did have some challenges to it, and that you had to, meet with a bunch of people and coordinate and learn things, and really had to, and it was a tough one to actually get through. Do you have any that come to mind?
Oh my God, I probably have 20, right? So it was a few years back. It was a transportation project in a city. So basically, I mean, you always have to deal with the political pressure in terms of, politicians or decision makers in governments thinks in political cycles. And that's something I think in life you have to understand if you want to be in any type of business. But anyway, in this one, it's probably more important. So that thinking in political cycles didn't necessarily match the project cycle, because I mean there was a lot of institutional capacity building that we needed to create. There was a lot of time in terms of studies that needed to be feasibility studies that needed to be finished in order to evaluate and assess. But then again, you have the political pressure, and you have to be able to manage that, to balance that without offending the other side or getting into a fight or an argument, but being very strict and strong in your arguments, and also understanding that your client, it would also be your partner down the road. So we had this project, and the pressure was tremendous. And these are type of situations when you have to be very smart if you want to escalate or not. Because if you escalate this, well, you can make a mistake and you could lose the credibility and the confidence of your counterpart forever. So it took a lot of sitting down from 7 o'clock in the morning till 10 p.m. in the city, a lot of calls, a lot of defining a strategy, and sort of like creating notches that could help them incentivize to make decisions in terms of reasonable decisions, but also understanding, and I think this is key, what their thinking was. If you come in being arrogant and thinking you have all the answers and you could prescribe your measures and they would do it right away, you're dead. I mean, you have to put yourself in their shoes. You have to understand what their motivations are. So we did that a lot. I had an amazing team that backed me up for that. I'm very proud of my team in that transaction in general. I'm very proud of my team, but that was pretty amazing. We spent quite a bit of time going around, talking to the mayor, talking to the president of the city council, bringing evidence. I mean, I think also this is something that people assume that if you're a politician, they're not capable to understanding data or information. But the problem is not the data and information, it's how you build a narrative, how you express it, how you come across. If you come across from a very technical perspective, even snap perspective, you might not get your point across. If you sit down and work with them and become one of their peer, they would understand. And of course, you have to compromise. At the end, there's a lot of compromise, and you have the line that you draw and you say, I cannot go any further than this line. But more often than it's very rare that that happens. You could always find a middle ground that would help the society, will help the people, and you will get the job done. It takes a lot of negotiation. I think it's communication, negotiation skills, and strategizing a lot.
It's so interesting because the more that you talk about this, the more I didn't realize how little I knew about the banking space. I thought it was all numbers, and now you're telling me there's actually quite a lot of psychology to it almost.
A lot. I would probably say not 50%, but a lot of this is solving problems. I mean, you become sort of a fixer in a way. But again, it depends on the role. I mean, I guess when I was more of a project analyst, a project team leader, I would still do a lot of this, but I would have to make sure my sensitivity analysis was right. And, I would do a lot of negotiation with my environmentalists to understand what the conditions or what the covenants of the contract are this and what are they needed for, and how can they make sense in light of the regulatory framework that we were in the country, and also talk to our lawyer in the transaction to get their feedback and synthesize that into I always say it, into a manageable solution for the counterpart and for the bank.
So tell me more about the team, because you mentioned you have a whole team with you, and you mentioned one of the roles that maybe you had earlier, which was the role of an analyst. What are some of the other roles that comprise this team that you run?
So what you have, let's say, for instance, you have a project team that is in charge of a transaction or a program, right? And that could be a loan, but we see it as a project, because there is a financing for X infrastructure or X investment that would have X, Y benefits. And then normally you would have a head of that project, the project team leader or the task team leader, and then you would have an environmental person that would do the social and environmental assessment of the project. You would have a financial analyst that would make sure the forecasts and projections of the project would make sense, and you would have a technical person, and they could be many, because for instance, we've been working a lot in cities, city projects or urban projects. Urban projects at times have different components, have roads, but also have water, and you would have different sectoral expertise that it's required, and you would have different people that would have that expertise. You would have a lawyer, because at the end, whatever you agree in that project evaluation has to come in a contract, and it has to be proofread, approved, and more importantly, signed. And you would have also, depending if it's needed or not, external consultants that could help you. So that would be the core, and that would be the team that would be in charge. And you would also have the people that are in the country offices, in our offices, local offices, that manage more the relation, are more customer relations, are more in terms of the managing the counterpart more from a commercial standpoint. So you would have that team, and then that team will interact internally with other teams. The risk assessment team that would see from an independent perspective what are the risks we're seeing and the mitigations we're proposing, and they would also have a say in that. They would say, well, we think you could probably do better if you demand this instead of this, and we be careful with this because you might have overlooked this. And you would also have sometimes a syndication team. I mean, if you're in need to raise funding for, like, let's say another part of the project because it's such a huge ticket and you need more money, so you would have a specialized team that would actually have the connections and the relationship with all the banks, private and public sector development banks, that could actually be interested in participating with you in this transaction. So, but the core team would be the project team. So, and then you have a larger team. My team, for instance, right now, where I have project team leaders and also have all the others that could make part of that project team. I'd also have the people that manage or administer, or that's the portfolio management of our transactions that are already in disbursement process, because that's another of our responsibilities. We also, I mean, our life doesn't end when we approve. Our life ends when it's built, and you have to monitor and see that it's being compliant. And we have annual visits, and we have all type of controls in check. And we work with our counterpart to make sure that, I mean, what we envisioned or thought at the beginning of the origination and the approval process ended up being in the actual construction or implementation of the project. So that's a larger team. So,
are there certain sectors that you guys, for whatever reason, due to the circumstances of today, that you guys are more focused on than others? I know we've talked about, infrastructure across transportation and communication. In going into 2021, is there, or 2021 through 2025, let's say, is there one focus that's increasing in prominence?
I would add to you mentioned energy, and I would say social infrastructure. I think, I mean, when you look across Latin America, there is a huge need of water. I mean, I think there are still, out of 600 million, 20 to 25 million or around that don't get access to drinkable water in the region. That is a country. That is a fair-sized country.
And why is that? What is the biggest challenge with water? Is it that they live far away from fresh water sources, or they don't have the plants that add the chemicals and processes to clean it up? Where does the lack of drinkable water come from?
I mean, the first one would definitely that they don't have necessarily the plant, and I think it's also it's a myriad of issues. One of them is the lack of proper infrastructure. And the other one is also that you have a lot of population that would move or migrate to urban areas for rural areas for whatever reason. And that when they settle in these places, I mean, these areas don't have any infrastructure, and they tend to get their water from rivers that are probably polluted and or don't get any access to it. That's an example of that. But I mean, so we're working a lot on that, and we're working a lot in urban infrastructure. And I think the key here is to think how Latin America, it's one of the most urban continents of the world. And what's been happening is a lot of migration from rural areas to urban areas, and the urban areas hasn't been prepared or ready to receive so many people. So you have to, step up and adjust to their requirements, and that takes time and takes a lot of resources and financing to do that, and also takes a lot of organizing and governance issues, because it's not only to put the infrastructure, but it's also to reassess the cities as a whole and and make it work. The problem is that you have many fronts at the same time, because I mean, you would say, well, from the trading perspective, you need roads, and the logistic perspective, you need roads. But if you don't have energy, but then you could have the generation, but you don't have the distribution capabilities. But then if you don't support the education sector and the reforms, you might not be helping the population to step up again in terms of what is required in this 21st century. So I think, I mean, we wish we had more resources, and we wish we could work more, but because there are many fronts at the same time. But again, to answer your question, it's I think the economic infrastructure I mentioned, and I would also say a lot of water. It's our key, and more and more our environmental agenda is very important as well. So.
Angel, as we wrap up here today, maybe you could just share more broadly with us your vision for the future. What type of, what is your kind of strategic influence moving forward, and what type of world do you want to see?
Well, I'm probably gonna say this more on a personal basis than necessarily corporate basis, and so I think we're definitely moving to. I mean, from the strategic perspective, there are many issues that need to be tackled. I mean, I think the first one for sure, it's inequality. I mean, we definitely need to tackle the issue of inequality. Has been persistent for many years, and it has worsened in the last year after the pandemic. I mean, you start seeing the consequences of that, and a lot has to do with education. I mean, you need to educate and hopefully help societies to the kids, the young people, to be capable, to be competitive, and to participate in the market labor, labor market in the next couple of decades. So that's one issue. The other one, it's for sure climate change. So I mean, when you look at, I mean, what's happening, global warming. I mean, we were talking about migration not long ago. More of this migration is for economic reasons, but you're also seeing, not necessarily in Latin America, but it could happen, but around the world, climate change migration. I mean, you take example of Bangladesh or India. I mean, people are in need to leave their homes because of the climate conditions that are taking place, and they don't find any subsistence or any capabilities to find food, and that would definitely put pressure from the government's perspective in urban areas. I would also think that the third issue would definitely be trade. I mean, we need to be capable to trade more interregionally, and hopefully to scale and benefit from the scalability of our capability. If we do that, we also help the inequality issue in terms of job creation. So I would probably say that if they ask me personally, that those would be at least three strategic activities or three strategic points that I would bring. And as your second question is, it's more of a philosophical one, but I think we need to learn that what we've learned in the past doesn't necessarily, or would not necessarily apply in the future. I mean, we need to understand the energy transition and how that's going to shift. I mean, our economy, even our political perspective and our geopolitics. We also need to be, I think, as we learned that what we learned in the past doesn't necessarily would apply anymore. We need to be open to technological innovation. So that's, I mean, you keep hearing all this fear about, IA or what's going to happen in the next 20 years in terms of job displacement or job elimination. And I think we have to be more positive about it, and we understand that what we have conquered as a human, humans, I mean, it's just a sign of success and progress, and that we can continue that, of course. And I think that's something that I would definitely like to see in the next 30, 40 years in the war. It's that we develop more inclusive governance structures, that could give more saying to the ones that need to say more, and we can actually listen to them. Again, it's very philosophical, the question, but if one of those three happens, I think I would be happy, so.
Well, we can't end on a better note than that. Angel, thank you so much for taking the time today. I know I appreciate it, our audience appreciates it, and can't wait to talk to you again.
Me too. Thank you very much. And well, anyway, have a great one. Okay.
Our leadership in science and industry, our hopes for peace and security, our obligations to ourselves as well as others, all require us to make this effort, to solve these mysteries, to solve them for the good of all men and for the progress of all people.